This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The pandemic led to a decline in the incarcerated population, and many states have been reevaluating the purpose of prisons. Today, Where We Live, Bill Keller, founding editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, joins us to talk about his new book, What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration. Keller details how the United States prison population became so massive and what we can learn from how other countries treat and house people in prison. Keller writes, "The American way of incarceration is a shameful waste of lives and money, feeding a pathological cycle of poverty, community dysfunction, crime, and hopelessness." His book explores the alternatives that could improve the U.S. prison system and help the formerly incarcerated lead productive lives. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you or a family member been incarcerated? Or do you have questions about the U.S. prison system? You can join us as well. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Bill Keller joins us on Zoom, again, founding editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project. That's an independent nonprofit news organization that covers the U.S. criminal justice system. Bill's had a long career also with the New York Times and also received a Pulitzer in 1989 for his reporting. Bill, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me, Nancy.
So when we think about the U.S. And how it became a world leader in locking people up, give us some broad strokes in your research.
Sure. One thing that's interesting about this phenomenon of mass incarceration is that it's relatively recent. For most of the 20th century, our incarceration rate was something like 100 people incarcerated for 100,000 population, which was a little high in the developed world, but not nearly as high as it became in the 70s. And in the 70s, we had the war on drugs, we had the white backlash against Black empowerment, and we had lots of politicians who were very keen to exploit those phenomenons by fear-mongering campaigns. So it went from 100 to more like 500 incarcerated people per 100,000 population. It's come down a little bit since then, but we still lead the world. We have twice as high an incarceration rate as Iran and Russia. And you can go down the more developed countries, the less like us they look. We're really an outlier in many respects.
You also detail the costs of what it means to incarcerate so many. And throughout the book, you're talking about the costs to someone's family and their communities, but also the financial costs. And it can vary to house a prisoner from one expert to the other, from $45,000 all the way to $450,000. Why is there such a difference there, Bill?
The 45,000 number comes from the actual budgets at the federal and state and local level, what we actually pay to cage people. It's more like $90 billion a year when you add in the pensions and health benefits for prison officers. But that much larger number is a notional one that was done by some researchers who tried to calculate the social cost of prison, everything from shortened life expectancies to the loss of child support, to the loss of income, to health impacts and mental health impacts. And they came up with a number that was 10 times the actual budget figure.
I mentioned that you're the founding editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project and its focus on the criminal justice system. But why did you write this book now, Bill?
I'd spent about 5 years immersed in the subject with some really good reporters and editors at the Marshall Project. And there's been a lot written about mass incarceration, how the numbers got so big and what an outlier we are in the world, but not very much written about what actually goes on in prisons and what we can do better. That's by design. The walls that were built to keep people in are also meant to keep nosy reporters and others out. So I'm not a scholar or an advocate. There are a lot of scholars who do excellent work on criminal justice, and there are a lot of advocacy groups like the Vera Institute and the Brennan Center and the Prison Policy Initiative that do advocacy work. I just wanted to do a journalistic kind of a primer on the history and context and life inside.
When we think about the idea of reforming the prison system, there's a lot of ideas. Some say that prisons should be abolished altogether. Others see prisons as becoming more like rehabilitation centers. So can you walk us through some of those ideas and the people that you talk to in your book?
Yeah. Well, first about the abolition movement. That's probably the fastest growing subset of the anti-prison campaign that's underway in the country. The abolitionists deserve a great deal of credit for pinpointing problems and injustices in the system. The problem with abolition is, well, twofold in my view. One of them is it's probably a fantasy to imagine that we're going to completely abolish prisons. There's no great popular demand for that. And even if you could abolish prisons altogether, that's to be the work of generations. And in the meantime, there are nearly 2 million people who are incarcerated, and you can't just write them off as cannon fodder for the revolution. So the heroes of my book, I guess, are people who are working within the system to try and make it better. They include educators who try to teach college classes in prisons, corrections officials, like some of the ones in Connecticut, for example, who've tried to make more humane and programming available, or more humane conditions and better programming available for people who are incarcerated. There are a number of religious organizations that deserve credit. There's a lot going on in the system, but it's mostly at the incremental level, not revolutionary.
And that's because of the cost. When we think about even reducing, I guess, the ratio between a correctional officer and the people that they are watching over, those that are incarcerated, Bill?
It's not just the cost. For the last 200 years, there's been a great tension in this country between an instinct to punish and a professed faith in rehabilitation and second chances. And at different points in our history, one or the other has gained the upper hand. I think it's something that the reason that we have such overall poor prison conditions is a punitive streak that probably came over with the Puritans.
But when we're talking about the Connecticut example, for instance, you looked at what the former Department of Correction Commissioner Scott Semple and former Governor Malloy tried to institute rehabilitation programs within particular prisons that focused on younger people who were incarcerated. The idea that they will be going back out into their communities and how to help them lead productive lives. But that's something that has not been able to be sustained, in my understanding, or at least there are budget cuts. So it's not an expansion of the program. It's more piecemeal.
Yeah, the Marshall Project, we sent a reporter along in 2015 on a trip that Scott Semple and Governor Malloy himself went on, along with corrections officials from a number of other states. And they went to Germany and looked at how they do things there, which is much more of a kind of normal, more like a college campus environment. The idea being that you want people who are going to be, 95% of people who are in prison are going to be released at some point, and you want them to not just fall off a cliff when they leave. They should be prepared to rejoin normal society. But while I was working on the book, I had an interview with Angel Quiros, who's the Scott Semple's successor, who was supportive of the work that Semple did, which consisted of setting up special units for for young inmates ages 18 to 25, using older inmates as mentors, called the True Unit. It's in Cheshire, a maximum security prison. And Kiros said, yes, we're going to support that, and the comparable women's program that Semple also left behind. But we can't afford to scale it because I'm under pressure to cut millions of dollars from the prison budget over the next couple of years.
And when the Marshall Project sent reporters to Scandinavian countries, can you explain to our listeners, how those facilities are set up, where there is such an emphasis on rehabilitation, even in the terms of how the public views prison, Bill?
You mean in Scandinavia?
Yes.
Yeah, the Scandinavians and the Germans have a whole different philosophy of prison. It starts with the premise that, yes, you break society's rules, you're going to be punished. But the punishment is you lose your freedom for some period of time, and that's it. But while you're incarcerated, you retain all of your other rights: the right to safety, the right to an education, the right to vote, which is an important way of keeping a bond with the larger civilization we live in. The other big difference, aside from just trying to sustain a sense of normalcy, is the role of the staff. In Germany, if you're going to be a corrections officer, you're going to spend 2 years at a college level training facility, including lessons in human rights law and psychology. And your role, once you've got a job inside a corrections facility, is to engage the prisoners to diagnose what it was that led them to crime in the first place and to address those issues. In the United States, if you're going to be a corrections officer, you're going to get, in most places, a few weeks of training heavy on crowd control and self-defense. And you're actively discouraged from having relationships with the inmates.
And this approach, it doesn't waver from someone who might be incarcerated that did a minor crime per se versus someone who might be seen as more dangerous, Bill?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, how do they treat dangerous offenders?
In Norway and Germany and Sweden, they try to defuse the danger. Their solution is not to lock people up in solitary confinement, although they will if somebody is in active danger. But the solution is to, because the corrections officers have relationships with the inmates, they can tell when somebody's about to have some sort of a mental break or whether there's a conflict brewing, and they can defuse it at the outset, which the officials I've talked to in Connecticut and other states seem to think is a model that can work here too. But it runs against a lot of opposition from the Corrections Officers Union, among others.
When you mentioned the opposition from correction officers unions, what are some of the points that they make?
Well, their role is to protect jobs, and they don't. But the argument that they make is mostly that it's dangerous. You need punitive solitary confinement to keep the other inmates and the staff safe, even though punitive solitary confinement has been shown to do horrible things to your mental health.
Again, you're hearing Bill Keller here where we live. He's written the new book, What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration. You can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Before we go to a break, Bill, when we think about duplicating some of the models in Scandinavian countries to the prisons in our country, what are some of the barriers?
Well, the two big ones. One is an obvious one of an attitude, that there's a kind of myth that if you're spending money on prisoners and giving them an education, that's some sort of a gift, whereas in fact it's an investment. The other thing is cost. The European prisons have much higher staffing ratios in order to retain those relationships with the inmates. And we haven't been willing to spend that kind of money.
When we think about the people that are incarcerated in our country, a majority of them are Black and brown individuals. And when we think about, the way these institutions have come up in our history and how our country is still wrestling with the legacy of racism, how does that factor into the conversations that we have in this country about prisons, Bill?
I think that it's no surprise that the fact that nearly 40% of the incarcerated people in America are Black men generates a reaction of indifference by a lot of Americans. It sounds harsh to say so, but there's quite a bit of public opinion research that shows that the fact that these are mostly Black, or so disproportionately Black inmates, means we don't care as much.
Again, you're listening to Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest, Bill Keller. You can read an excerpt of his new book, What's Prison For, on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to continue talking with Bill and hear from State Senator Gary Winfield about Connecticut's efforts to reform its criminal justice system. You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking about prison reform and how states are re-examining the purpose of incarceration. Eventually, people are released. Are they set up to succeed on the outside? It's a question my guest, Bill Keller, explores in his new book, What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration. Keller is founding editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, a nonprofit news organization that covers the U.S. criminal justice system, and Connecticut's efforts to rehabilitate some of the incarcerated under the former Malloy administration was included in Keller's book. Joining us now on Zoom is State Senator Gary Winfield, who represents New Haven and West Haven, and he's co-chair of the legislature's Judiciary Committee. Senator Winfield's been a leader in helping to reshape conversations around criminal justice and juvenile justice in our state. Senator Winfield, welcome back to the show.
Good morning. Glad to be back.
You spent a lot of time wrestling with this question in your capacity as a state lawmaker, thinking about what's prison for and how these institutions impact not only the individual, but their families, the community. I wonder if you can respond to what Bill Keller has shared with us so far.
Yeah, what Bill's been sharing is very much in the same vein of the things that I've talked about during the course of my tenure as a legislator. One thing I wanted to point out really quickly that Bill said a few minutes ago was when he was talking about the attitude of people in general about prisons and who's in prison and how we see spending money on education as a gift. That tells you something about the real attitude we have. If we're spending money on these people who are in prison on education, which we should have gotten in our public schools, something's failing before they get to prison. And so part of what I see as the problem is exactly what Bill is saying. You have a large percentage of people of color in the prisons who are not the people that the general public will look at and see themselves in, and don't also recognize things that should be apparent. If you need to get that education in prison, you're not getting it in school. So we don't talk about the things that lead us to prison. And then when you get to the prisons, we don't have a focus on it. Even when you think about some of the work that Connecticut has done, like Bill and you yourself mentioned the True Unit. We instituted the True Unit. but the true unit sits inside a prison. It largely functions the way that it functioned before. And so there is a kind of schizophrenic relationship even going on there.
When we think about some of the programs within prisons, as you mentioned, in-prison education or job training, therapy for drug and mental health, Senator Winfield, again, these are programs that some that are incarcerated have been able to get at particular prisons, but it's not something that has been able to be scaled up. And so part of that is changing the public's view of what incarceration does and what it can, how it can be changed to help people when they are released.
Yes, absolutely. And part of that is an effort to do so. If we're being honest, we institute these programs, it's piecemeal, and there isn't really a real effort on the part of legislators to create these programs as programs that deal with the whole of the institution. So you think about the true unit. If you have 50 people inside of a prison and they're getting this program, what you actually do is you say, for you 50, you have something different. We can go out to the public and say, look, we went to Germany and we learned some things and we implemented this, and we will do that. What we will not do is transform that prison in the way that the prisons we saw were. And we're fine with that. Because I'll tell you, I sit over the corrections budget. I'm not just the chair of judiciary. I sit over the corrections budget on appropriations. And I'm wrestling all the time to try to bring the appropriate money for programs in the prisons. And the conversation I am not having is about how do we create a Connecticut where what we do in a true unit is what we do.
Bill Keller, I'm wondering if you can respond, because you've also, in your research for the book and your colleagues at the Marshall Project, looked at other programs in other states that might surprise some of our listeners who are used to progressive Connecticut, that have also tried these programs to help those who are incarcerated. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about this idea of a therapeutic versus punitive setting.
Yeah, the other states that I focus a bit on in the book, although they're not the only ones doing it, are North Dakota, Oregon, and Pennsylvania. And the senator's right that in most of these places, it's an experimental unit inside a system that is fundamentally unchanged. And it's fundamentally unchanged because, in large part because of the cost. But also, I mean, one thing that the senator sort of alluded to is people are coming into prison having been unsuccessful at getting a decent education. The prison system serves as a kind of catchment for all of the poisons in society: lack of education, lack of housing, mental health issues, addiction issues. And you can't really reform the criminal justice system as a whole until you address these issues in society that flow into the system. So it's not just a matter of budgets, it's a matter of the sort of tsunami of problems that wash into our prison system.
You also talked about the state of California. They were able to reduce the number of people incarcerated, I believe, because of a court order. But there have been some, things that have happened related to the communities now because there hasn't been investment on the community level. Bill, can you talk about that?
Yeah, California has been for years now under a Supreme Court order that said that their overcrowding was a violation of the constitutional protection against cruel and unusual punishment. And they've succeeded in reducing their prison population, state prison population, by 25%. Nobody else has come close to doing that. But they didn't make other alternative arrangements for those people. So an awful lot of them ended up in county jails, which are even more poorly equipped to do rehabilitation than state prisons. And a lot of them ended up homeless in homeless encampments. So they can declare victory, but it was sort of a hollow victory.
Senator Winfield, I'm wondering if you can respond to what California saw. And then even when we think about some of the conversations Connecticut has had in the last couple of years related to juveniles. And on one side, people want to see stricter penalties for a young person who may commit a crime. But again, it's not looking at the long-term view of what happens to these young people who may end up in the adult system.
Yeah, what I want is a safer system for everyone. And I don't just mean a prison system, I mean just a system of life, right? Mm-hmm. So I start off asking the question of how do we get there? Not in the immediate, I see a crime, how do I think about that crime? And I think too much of the time we think about there was a crime, we need to do something about the crime, and not, as you suggest, about if we make a choice, a policy choice in this scenario, we make a choice, what are the outcomes of that choice? Because if we think about what the outcomes of the choice are, what we know is if we send young people into the prisons, they're more likely to go back into those prisons. They're more likely to spend a lifetime of being in prison. So the question is, how did they get to the prison in the first place, both young and old folks? And if we figure out how they got there, then we should be dealing with those things while we are dealing with the aftermath of a crime. What we want to do is deal with the aftermath of a crime, absent dealing with what the causes are. And that is a dangerous thing that leads you to a less safe community. And so here's the conundrum. As a politician, what do? Do you go to the public and say, we have to spend money over here where you don't want to spend money when we're having a conversation about taxes? Do you say we have to give money to these communities that are not your community because we have not historically done that, or the way that we've done it historically is not equitable? Those are hard conversations to have. And so what we tend to do is we tend to say, what you want to hear is us tell you that we're going to be tougher on crime. And we do that. We saw that in the 1990s. Clearly, it did not work. And yet, again, here we are in 2022 having a very similar conversation and trying to do the same thing.
I was thinking back to efforts in our state to end the use of solitary confinement in our prisons, Senator Winfield. And I remember when you were part of this discussion, of course, talking about the impact not only on those who are incarcerated, but the people who work within prisons. What it does to the correctional officers who are also interacting with the incarcerated on a daily basis, and how to fix a system when you have these high stresses. And this is the result, right? That they're told that this must be used. This particular segregation must be given to a person because of their behavior. But how that heightens the whole environment for everyone. And I'm wondering if you can talk more about that.
Yeah. So when we've been having that conversation for a very long time. In 2017, we kind of ramped it up. We brought a mock solitary cell to the state capitol, so legislators could get a taste of what it might be like. We weren't suggesting that it was exactly what we do here. And what I saw was legislators who had the ability to open that cell, walk out at any moment, who couldn't spend more than 5 minutes there. And I start off with that because I want people to understand you have policymakers who are not understanding what it is to be in this environment. They don't have family members in this environment. They won't put themselves in this environment. That's an issue. So I spent four plus hours in this environment. And what I could tell you is that immediately it had a huge impact on me, and I had the ability to open the door. So what we know from research is that you're more likely to operate in a way that is aggressive, that is violent, if you're in that as a person who is incarcerated. If you have to oversee those folks, you have to, in order for you to continue to keep people in those conditions, you have to make it okay in your brain in some way. That's problematic because it's not okay. And so it has an effect both on the person who's inside and the person who is overseeing those people inside. It makes that prison itself less safe. That is not what we want to do. We've known this for a very long time, and yet we refuse to operate as if we do. In our prison system, whether it be solitary, restrictive housing, just the prison system, the things we do go against everything we know is the better way of doing this. And at some point, we have to face the fact that what we have been doing, while historically it has been what we're doing, is not the right way to conduct prisons. There's a reason we have the True Unit. There's a reason we faced the public and went on 60 Minutes and all of that stuff, because we want to show people we're doing better, but it's not real. At some point, we have to make it real.
I bring up that example, and thank you, Senator Winfield, for giving us that context again. It's been a couple years since we've talked about it here on this show. But Bill Keller, you had profiled and wrote about what was happening in Oregon and how the COs, the correctional officers, how they were trained so that, they were also experiencing high rates of diabetes, heart failure, hypertension. And you quoted someone that said the U.S. prisons had failed us, the people who live in them, the people who work in them, and their families and communities. What was the response when the COs were trained to work differently, to maybe have more of that role that you see in one of the Scandinavian or German prisons versus the punitive aspect?
Yeah, the Oregon case is a really interesting one. They worked with a group called Amend, which is based at the University of California, San Francisco. And they actually declared the main purpose of the corrections system reform being addressed not at the prisoners, but at the staff, to try and, by working through the staff, treating it as a sort of a wellness issue, a public health issue, that would permeate the culture of the place. It's too early to have definitive, scientific data showing how it works, but from talking to both the number of corrections officials and advocates and academics in Oregon, there's a pretty good sense that where they concentrated the effort, which was mainly in the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, with the biggest of the prisons, it made a demonstrable effect on the culture of the prison. But in the more outlying prisons, which Oregon, like a lot of states, tends to situate prisons in remote rural areas. In some of those areas, they just don't have the resources. It's even something as simple as getting into an Alcoholics Anonymous program, which are important in prisons. You can have a 6-month wait.
We've spent some time talking about the environment within U.S. prisons, as well as the factors within our society that lead some to be incarcerated at a much higher rate than others. But I'm also wondering, when we think about the question, "What's prison for?" which is the title of Bill Keller's book, one of my guests, are we ever going to get to the point where the majority of the public truly believe a person can change and deserves another chance? Because we know, this has been shown in data, as well as just hearing from people who've been incarcerated, they may finish their sentence and they may go back to their communities, but that prison record continues to follow them. And do people really believe that someone deserves a second chance? And how does that play into how our society views prisons? I'll start with you, Senator Winfield.
I think it's a question that if you ask a dozen people, you'll probably get 4 or 5 different answers. It plays heavily into the way that we operate. In the policy sphere, when I'm trying to do the reforms that I've worked on, I'm always being hit with, look at the crime that this person committed. And that crime is almost as if it exists absent the fact that a human being was involved with it. Human beings change over time. That's just what we do. We do not remain the person that we were. I'm not the person I was 5 years ago. Almost none of us are. And so it seems to me to be strange that we will recognize that human beings change over time, and yet someone who's committed a crime all of a sudden has these characteristics that are immutable. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I think as a policymaker, part of my job is not just to get the success, right? Part of my job is to lay the groundwork, the foundation, to tell the public the truth, whether they agree with me or not, so that we can have a real conversation. We know that people change. Anyone who's had a child knows that people change. We just have to actually accept it and then operate as if we know that.
Before I hear from Bill, I want to take a quick call. Eliza is calling in from Middletown. Eliza, what did you want to share?
Hi, good morning. I just want to let listeners know that what the senator is saying is absolutely real. I have never, in fact, heard a politician in Connecticut give this big a blast of reality about what goes on. I've been inside. I'm actually paranoid to say which prison because they're so punitive. I might not get back in if I criticize. But as an educator, and I know a lot about the True Unit, and it's window dressing, and it depends largely on the free labor of older prisoners to run the program. I just can't thank you enough. I hope people listen, and thanks for the show.
Thank you, Eliza. I want to take one more call. Valentine is calling in from Hartford. What do you want to share, Valentine?
Well, I'm a volunteer with the Alternatives to Violence Project, so I conduct workshops on dealing with conflict other than by being violent, and I've been on the True Unit. Many of our facilitators are in that unit, and I co-facilitate workshops with my incarcerated co-facilitators, and some of them are among the people I respect most in the world. They shouldn't be locked up. But I attended a conference of Alternatives to Violence Project International in Ireland, and we heard a very high-ranking prison official talk to us. AVP, it's called, is very big in Ireland. They work in a lot of prisons. And he said, if someone has been with us for 10 years and they're not ready to be returned to the community, we feel that we have failed. And I just wish that attitude could be brought back to American prisons, as the senator and as the author have been saying.
Thank you, Valentine. We're actually short on time, but I appreciate you calling in to share that. Bill Keller, I wanted to go back to you, maybe to respond to what our listeners have shared about some of these programs in our state, and the wider question of how we as a society can change our perceptions of what prison is for.
Yeah, one of the reviewers of my book described me as surprisingly optimistic, and I want to make clear that I'm not that optimistic about sweeping change in the system. Change, at least at this point, what we're getting is some pilot programs, some incremental changes, but that's important. Even if it's only on a small scale, and it should be on a larger scale. I mean, one of the numbers that haunts me in the book is that 600,000 people are let out of prisons every year. And it's our choice whether we want to send them home brutalized, alienated, stigmatized, and lacking any employable skills, or whether we want to give them a chance to be decent citizens and decent neighbors.
It's a good point to end on. Bill Keller, again, is author of the new book, What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration. An excerpt is on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Thank you, Bill, for coming on. We really appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Lucy. I appreciate being on the show.
You're listening to Where We Live. State Senator Gary Winfield will stay with us, and after the break, we're going to talk about a new report that looks at the Connecticut incarcerated population and the communities that are most impacted. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. More than half of Connecticut's incarcerated population are from 6 Connecticut cities. That's according to a new report from the Prison Policy Initiative based in Massachusetts. The report's aim with this data is to show the scope of mass incarceration in certain communities, particularly those with large Black and Latino populations. Joining us now on Zoom with more is Mike Wessler with the Prison Policy Initiative. Mike, welcome to Where We Live.
Thank you so much for having me.
So give us some brief background on how this got started, this particular report that was released.
Yeah, so as the Senator and Bill were talking about earlier, in order to solve the problem of mass incarceration, we need to really address the underlying issues that are there. Issues related to poverty, issues related to housing, issues related to mental health. But for too long, we've not known exactly where to invest those resources. We could make some guesses based on things related to county of conviction for people who are incarcerated and where crime is reported, to figure out where to make investments to address crime and mass incarceration in our communities. But we didn't know exactly where people in prison truly came from. Thanks to a reform that was really championed by Senator Winfield, though, in 2021 to end what's known as prison gerrymandering, we have, for the first time ever, a really crystal clear picture and really granular picture of where people in prisons actually call home. And that's because prison gerrymandering is a problem that is created by the Census Bureau. And the Census Bureau counts incarcerated people as residents of their prison cell rather than at their home address. And this is despite a whole host of factors. People, when they leave prison, they're most likely to return to their home communities. They still consider their home communities home. That's where they have their social ties and connections. And when this reform was passed in 2021, the Redistricting Commission in Connecticut had to adjust the census data to better reflect the true population of the state, and when it comes to incarcerated people. We took that data, kind of mashed it up a little bit to really figure out where people in Connecticut prisons call home. As you mentioned, 6 Connecticut cities, Hartford, New Britain, Waterbury, New Haven, Bridgeport, and New London, account for about 17% of the state's population, but they account for about 50% of the people who are behind bars. I think that's a troubling number, and I think it's one that should raise a lot of eyebrows, because it should tell us that something's going on in these communities. There is some public policy failings that are happening in these communities that are causing dramatically higher rates of people to end up behind bars.
Let's look at Hartford as one of the examples in the report when we think about the number of people that are incarcerated that come from Hartford. But the report drills down even deeper when you think about particular neighborhoods and the people that are impacted. Can you tell us more, Mike?
Yeah, so the state as a whole has an imprisonment rate of about 288 people per 100,000 residents. That's high by any other standard globally. No other countries, as was discussed in previous segments, they don't incarcerate people at that level. But when you look at the city level, it becomes even more troubling. Hartford locks people up at a rate of 1,065 people per 100,000 residents. That means over 1% of Hartford's population is behind bars. And that fundamentally changes and weakens the fabric of those communities. And that means that there's less economic support for families. There's less emotional support. It really weakens Hartford and other communities that have similarly high incarceration levels. But as you mentioned, this data allows us to drive even deeper. And I think that's what makes this data so powerful. Not only does it show the scale of this problem, but it also shows the massive disparities that are within communities. Inside Hartford, the Upper Albany neighborhood, they send people to prison at a rate of about 1,900 per 100,000 residents. That's almost 2% of their population. That's almost 10 times higher than the state as a whole. Something's going on in Upper Albany that there needs to be more investment to address some of the challenges that are sending people to prison. But when you look just a few blocks away to the West End neighborhood, 491 people per 100,000. So it's about half the incarceration rate of the city as a whole. So it shows that there are dramatic disparities, and where you grow up and where you live can set you on a dramatically different path. And it's only a matter of blocks that can result in these changes.
State Senator Gary Winfield is still with us. Senator Winfield, I'm wondering if you can respond to what Mike has shared and, how this data can be used from your perspective as a lawmaker.
I'm happy that we have this data. Some of the stuff, if you're involved in this, you know it, but you don't necessarily have hard data to demonstrate. So I'm glad we have the data. I just think that people have to come to understand what this data is actually telling us. It is policy that has gotten us into this situation. And when we are thinking about coming out of this situation, we think it's personal choice alone that gets us out of this situation. That just doesn't make sense. Policy tells us whether or not there are resources in your area, around your area. It tells us whether there's public transportation to the jobs that you don't have in the community you're in. It tells us whether or not your neighborhood is a compacted neighborhood. And when you see the number of people that we are seeing going in and out of our prisons, there is a follow-on effect from it. It's not just the people who've been in there, it's the community. And that's how you get to the point where we have community level trauma and other things. So what I would say is this: we have communities that are over-policed and under-resourced, and we have to flip that. The solution when we have crime in any neighborhood, with all due respect, and I think police do a good job largely, but all due respect is not to put more police, whether you call it broken windows or community policing, because it's more police in the community. The solution is to deal with the causes. And until we deal with that, reports like this will always pertain.
Mm. And when you say deal with the causes, more investment in housing, education, jobs, healthcare, Senator Winfield?
All of the above. We've had many conversations, particularly around the issue of housing, that go nowhere. Moving, whether it be different zoning or moving people to areas of high opportunity or whatever it is. And then people turn around and they say, but why do we have the crimes? It's because you refuse to change. You're going to continue to have the things that you have. Equity, I said this in a different conversation, equity requires revenue. What I mean by that is, if you want to deal with these situations and get us to a place of equity, you're going to have to spend money to do the things, to undo the things that we've done by policy choices.
Again, you've been hearing State Senator Gary Winfield, who is co-chair of the Judiciary Committee. Thank you so much for your time on the show. I also want to thank Mike Wessler with the Prison Policy Initiative based out of Massachusetts. We'll be sure to link to that report on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Mike, thank you for your time on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchil. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. Thanks for listening.